Former Attorney General Rob McKenna joining us on the line. So he's not willing to make the pledge. He says it's in the legislation. It's written in there. There's no way we can tax other people. Should we be comfortable with that? Do we take that to the bank?
Well, isn't this the same legislature that a majority voted to adopt the initiative of the legislature in 2025 that says no state income tax?
Well, that was a pie crust promise.
The pie crust promise, easily made, easily broken. So, can anyone, including the governor, point to an example of an income tax that started out, only hitting higher earners and wasn't eventually extended to everybody else? Of course not, because it always is. And that's especially true in Washington, John, because this legislature and now this governor have built-in structural deficits to the state budget as far as the eye can see. I think it was the Washington Policy Center that said they came in with this is midway through the biennium, mind you, halfway through the budget. They came in and said, we got a $2 billion shortfall, and they promptly proposed $3 billion in new spending.
Yeah.
So this is not a money problem for the state. When I left office, the state budget was about $34 billion a biennium, and now it's about $80 billion.
Yeah.
How many of your listeners saw their family income go up 124% in the last 12 years, right? So it's a spending issue. They never have enough money. And, of course, they say, we got to have this tax because we need to fund school lunches. Really? Out of $80 billion, you haven't been able to fund school lunches, an idea that you just threw into this at the last second in order to make it more appealing to voters?
Yeah, so buying votes is not cheap. Buying votes is not cheap, Rob, right? You want to make people dependent. If you can make them dependent, you can count on their vote. So we're going to, by the way, I was looking at the history. So the Washington State Supreme Court ruling in, I think it was Colleton versus Chase. Yeah. And there was an initiative on the ballot and it passed by 70%. People said, yes, we want a state income tax. Now, this was started by the Grange folks, Washington State Grange. These were farmers. They didn't like the fact that their property taxes were basically supporting so much of Washington's budgets and revenue spending. So 70% of the people, it was the initiative 69 in 1932. It was a 1% to 7% income tax. It goes before the Supreme Court, and they're like, no, I'm sorry. Even though 70% approved of this thing, property is tax. Your income is property, and property cannot be taxed unless it's going to be taxed equally for everyone. So the Washington Supreme Court kicked it out in 1933. What do you think is going to happen now?
Well, a little more history. First of all, the reason that they held that income is property is that in 1930, the voters adopted an amendment to the Constitution, also supported by the Washington State Grange, by the farmers, which redefine property in the state constitution to mean everything, tangible and intangible, subject to ownership. They wanted to reach every form of intangible property, including stocks, bonds, money, income, etc. They didn't put a list in. They said everything. Mm-hmm. So unless a listener thinks they don't own their own income, pretty obviously, income is a form of property, and that's what the state Supreme Court found in 1933. In 1934, after they had struck down the progressive income tax that had been passed, in 1934, a measure went to the ballot to amend the Constitution again.
Yes.
To exclude income from the definition of property. It failed, 57% to 43%. There were 5 more efforts to amend the state constitution to exclude income from property. The most recent happened in the 1970s. That last one, the 6th of the 6 constitutional amendments, was defeated with 77% of the voters saying no.
Yeah.
So the voters have had many, many opportunities to exclude income from the definition of property in the state constitution. They've turned them all down, and they've turned them down by increasing margins over the decades, pretty clearly signaling that, we think income is property. We like it that way. We want to keep it that way.
Now, the Washington State Supreme Court can do a Humpty Dumpty move, and I can determine, the word is whatever I determine the word to mean. They did that with capital gains when we refer to an excise tax, right? So that's, even though the IRS is like Thank you, Washington. That's not how we describe it. So how are they how are they going to wiggle through on this one? What will they determine now? Because they look at case law. They'll look at the cases from 1934, 1933. They'll look at that and think, well, this is what the Washington State Supreme Court said then. But what will they do? This is a living, breathing document, and therefore let's smother it in the crib. I mean, how do they determine this one?
Well, first of all, this does not come down to a single state Supreme Court decision, right? There have been a series of state Supreme Court decisions that have reached the same conclusion as that first Supreme Court panel in 1933, right? So multiple Supreme Court panels have found that income is property because, as one of the justices said, it's impossible to imagine a broader definition of property. It is one of the two broadest definitions of property in America in a state constitution, along with Pennsylvania, right? So this did not turn on some sort of tortured reasoning by the 1933 Supreme Court. It turns on a series of Supreme Court justices over many decades looking at the plain language of the Constitution and concluding that, yep, income is part of everything. It's an intangible, and it's subject to ownership because that's the way the amendment was drafted. It was intended to reach every form of intangible property, including income.
So what happens now? So for you working on this case, how long will it take you to prepare? And then what are the steps until we see a decision regarding the income tax in the state of Washington?
It will be filed very soon, and it will go to a superior court in Washington, which will declare that this tax is unconstitutional because the superior court is bound by all of this Supreme Court precedent, not just the 1933 case, but all the other cases that have found that income is property. And the court will probably note for itself, well, looking at this definition, how do you say income isn't property if it's, everything tangible and intangible subject to ownership? So, the Superior Court doesn't get to rewrite precedent, right? They are bound by precedent. So, when I brought a case some years ago now, about 5 years ago, and overturned Seattle's income tax, that's what happened. The King County Superior Court judge said, yep, it's unconstitutional because it's not uniform. It's not limited 1%. The state tried to get the state government, the Attorney General, Bob Ferguson, tried to get the Supreme Court to grant direct review. They said no. So the case went to the Court of Appeals. Court of Appeals said the same thing. Yep, it's property. That's what the law says. It's binding precedent. We don't get to change precedent. And then the Supreme Court declined to grant review. They said, no, we're not going to touch that decision of the Superior Court overturning the Seattle income tax or the Court of Appeals ruling upholding that ruling. And that ruling stays in effect. So they could do that here, too. They could decline to review it directly. They could send it to the Court of Appeals and then not grant review. The assumption that the proponents of this tax are making is that the Supreme Court will grant direct review, and then they will suddenly decide that, notwithstanding that incredibly broad definition of property, that somehow income is not your property. And that the hope is on the part of the proponents, apparently including Governor Ferguson, is that the Supreme Court will decide income is not property, and therefore this progressive income tax is fine. Now, keep in mind, this issue of whether income is property has been in front of the court very recently. When I joined another team of lawyers and we brought a challenge to the capital gains excise tax, we got it overturned in Superior Court. Then the Supreme Court did take it on direct review, and then the Supreme Court upheld it, as you already pointed out, as an excise tax, even though it sure looks like a tax based on income, but they said it was an excise. Okay. But they went out of their way to explain why it was an excise tax and not an income tax. And when one of the parties that intervened in the case asked them to take the opportunity to overturn Culleton, they said no. They relied instead on the fact that capital gains tax, in their view, was not an income tax. So they had a chance to, overturn Culleton then. They didn't take it. I don't think they'll do it this time. At least they shouldn't, given that the language of the Constitution is exactly the same as it was all the other times the Supreme Court has looked at it. And right.
So what was their game plan, Rob? If you try to get into the head of the Democrats that passed this thing overwhelmingly, they Were they assuming that, well, there's going to be 4 justices stepping down or they're going to be appointed? Were they thinking we'll just get our guys on the field and our guys will go along with this thing and make up, change a few words around and go, well, we look at it this way, even though there's precedent and even though there's been years and years of this. I think it was Jamie Peterson, Senator Peterson, had said, well, things have changed a lot since 1933 was a long time ago. I mean, that's what
he's saying. Exactly right. He's saying this is all about a single Supreme Court decision in 1933. He never talks about the language in the Constitution. If he is pressed on it, he says, well, income isn't really property. It's sort of money and flow, but it's not property. Right?
Yeah.
So if pressed, he'll descend into that kind of metaphysical, I think, nonsense. But he's also signaling he thinks this is a different court, and that this court will finally do what all the other Supreme Court panels have declined to do, which is to rewrite the Constitution. And keep in mind that again, this is not an old question that every 10 years or so someone proposes an income tax.
Yeah.
And 6 other legislatures decided, we want to be able to tax income progressively. The way to do that is to amend the Constitution. And you think about it, they've managed to find 2/3 majorities in the House and the Senate 6 times, which is what it takes to send an amendment to the voters to amend the Constitution. 6 times. That's a lot. This legislature said, no, we don't need to do that. We'll just get the Supreme Court to be our super legislature, and they'll rewrite it for us. But I don't think the Supreme Court's going to fall for that.
Yeah.
I think they're being put in a very difficult position where the expectations of these legislators is, you'll just find something different than all the other Supreme Courts, and never mind that the voters have been very, very clear, for decades that they like it the way it is. Never mind that, but you just decide that this should be read differently.
But Rob, these justices are appointed by the governor. So, they sit down there and they, so how do you feel about we need this? Listen, if you want that job, and it's a cushy job, they make you retire at 74, but you don't have to be the smartest guy in class. You just got to be somebody that's going to go along to get along. You get in there, and because the governor says, hey, we've got this important thing of this income tax, you want to know how you feel about that. I'm going to play for you because Jamie Peterson explains when somebody asks, how's property not income? He says that a lawyer can explain it. So since you are a lawyer, former Attorney General Rob McKenna, here comes your, you have to try to decode this. Hit that, Joe, please. Here we go. So this is Jamie Peterson answering.
In the law up to that time, there was an idea that there were essentially 2 kinds of taxes: property taxes, taxes on having something, owning it, and excise taxes, taxes on doing something, right?
Do people not own their income, though?
No, I think it is. No, they own the property once it has become income. This is not, if you think about it, I've been trying to think of good analogies to this. We sometimes have people who come into the United States, right? But they're not considered to have been in the United States because of the legal mechanism by which they got here, right? So there's a question about whether you're lawfully present. It's just an immigration idea. This maybe makes sense only to lawyers.
Okay. Rob, you're a lawyer.
It doesn't make sense to lawyers. Jamie Peterson is a lawyer. It doesn't make sense to lawyers, right? This is not, the thing about this issue is, and I really came to realize this working on the state income tax and then the capital gains tax, there's nothing at all new about any of this.
Mm-hmm.
These guys aren't being clever at all, right? Many legislatures have decided they want a progressive income tax, but this is the first legislature that said, well, I know I voted to take an oath to uphold the Constitution and the laws of the state, and I know the law of the state is that income is property because the Supreme Court has said so multiple times, and it's what the Constitution says, but I'm still going to vote for this against the oath that I took, and I'm hoping the state Supreme Court will agree with me that this time is different somehow, right?
Yeah.
So it is pure politics. They think that they've got a Supreme Court that will do their bidding now. I actually have more faith in that in the Supreme Court. And, I obviously disagree with their capital gains tax decision.
Yeah.
But, at least that time they passed a tax that was called an excise tax and, was set up like an excise tax. And even though that same effort had been struck down by the Supreme Court previously, because they said, actually, it's an income tax, don't care what you call it. This time they had a basis, they had some basis for reaching the conclusion that the excise tax really was an excise tax. Here, you've got a new law that says, no, we want a progressive income tax. And we're just saying it. We're calling it like it is. This is like the Seattle income tax case where they just passed an income tax. And, for the Supreme Court to reach the conclusion that Senator Peterson wants, they don't just have to decide, they can't just decide that, well, there's some sort of old law. This is based on some sort of precedent. This prior Supreme Court decision was based on in 1933. They actually have to conclude that the language of the Constitution doesn't mean what it says, that people don't, own their income. And it's hard. It's just really hard for me to get my head around the idea that anyone will believe.
Listen, Rob McKenna, I'm going to let you go, but beforehand, so I can take some of my money. You ready? If I were to go into the poly market, not that this is going to happen, right? But if I were want to put $5,000 down that I still owe Sully from 10 years ago, can I bet that this thing gets kicked out and there is no income tax in the state of Washington? I mean, how sure, Curly, I get an inside tip for you. I know I'm a former attorney general and I can't encourage gambling, which I believe is illegal in the state of Washington. But if I were you, I think we're going to win this thing. So, just let you. What do you think, Rob? Come on.
I think the Supreme Court signaled in the capital gains tax they understand the difference between an income tax and an excise tax. And they decided just a few years ago, we're not going to overturn this income tax. And nothing has, we're not going to overturn that income tax precedent from 1930, and nothing has changed since then in the law.
There you go.
Let it ride.
Let it ride. Mama needs a new pair of shoes. All right, Rob McKenna, former Attorney General, go get him there in court. Fight for the Constitution, which some people have read. Thank you, Rob. Appreciate it.